I'm Devesh Kapoor, the director of CASI, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the third and final Khemka lecture uh, of this academic year. It's a great pleasure, like for me personally, to welcome Professor Sunil Khilnani, who is the Star Foundation Professor and Director of the South Asia Studies program at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Most of you know of him through his seminal book, The Idea of India, which is sort of a required sort of reading in almost any grad course on India. And it's a beautifully sort of written work if some of you have not read it. And in some ways it sort of epitomizes sort of everything about Sunil and his work. But interestingly, he began his academic career sort of working on France, not on India. And I was joking with him that if he had started working on Haryana, would his ideas have been as clear if he had rather than France? But his book has recently been translated. It's been translated in four languages, including sort of Arabic. For the past, I don't know how many years, Sunil, you've been working on I think, the definitive biography of Nehru. And I had hoped that that's the book he would launch here, but I think next year we can have him again. Maybe he can speak then on that book. But this afternoon he'll be speaking on the title of his talk is Arguing Democracy, Intellectuals and Politics in Modern India. Sunil, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Devesh, for that kind introduction. I think Haryana might have actually helped to clarify my thinking much better than French ideas. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I wanted to thank Devesh for the invitation, and also, of course, the Khemka endowment for sponsoring this and making possible this lecture. The idea of democracy, brought into being on an Athenian hillside some 2,500 years ago, has traveled far, and today attaches itself to a growing number of political projects. In everyday political talk, as well as in the specialized fields of the political and social sciences, terms like spreading democracy, promoting democracy, and of course imposing democracy have become ubiquitous. Underlying such talk is a belief in democratic universalism. The idea, as Larry Diamond, erstwhile advisor to Paul Bremer in Iraq, has put it, and I quote, "Every country in the world can be democratic." Yet, even as the ambition is asserted to spread democracy across the globe, our conceptions of what democracy is have narrowed to a checklist model, a prescriptive blueprint based almost entirely on Western experience. We can perhaps sympathize with the impulse towards determinacy in defining democracy in the face of the term's wayward history, an impulse that wishes rightly to avoid a relativist dissipation of democracy's meanings. However, the peripatetic life of the democratic idea suggests the increasing inadequacy of a history and the prospective lessons drawn from such a history that is written solely from within the terms of the West's experience. Today, the idea of democracy has been drawn into quite other historical vortices, giving rise to political experiences that are transformative of the idea itself. Democracy as a political idea draws its formidable appeal and power from its promise, from its resolute openness to the future, not from its ancestral pedigree. There is no special normative or analytical privilege which historically prior forms of democracy can hope to command. Nor will the prior forms necessarily be more practically useful in the years ahead. Rather, in thinking about the possibilities of democracy across the world, the possibility that every country can become democratic, the political experience of countries like India will probably be a more valuable resource than the cases of, say, the United States, France, or Britain. So I'd like this evening to talk about India's democracy, the most expansive and arguably most significant experiment with democracy since the late 18th century. Habitually noted as a success of some sort, the Indian experiment is just as often absolved from serious interrogation. Following the political congratulations, intellectual condescension all too often settles in large part because the Indian case seems too exotic to understandings based on the Western experience. Indeed, the emergence of India's democracy, I think, is a direct challenge to the axioms of classical theory, particularly those which stress social homogeneity and political unanimity. In India, a country of countless dense allegiances and loyalties, democracy, both as a form of government and as an idea, is, as the jargon has it, consolidated. Since independence in 1947, the country has held 14 national elections and is currently in the throes of its 15th, and many more in its regional states, and dozens of peaceful alterations of government have occurred. In this respect, India's political system has succeeded in institutionalizing uncertainty. Democracy as a type of government, a political regime of laws and institutions, has achieved a real, which is to say, inherently problematic and partial existence. Equally significantly, the idea of democracy has penetrated the Indian political imagination. Rising popular belief in democracy is manifest in several ways. Surveys, for instance. In 1971, 43% of Indians expressed their support for parties, assemblies, and elections. In 1996, almost 70% did so. At independence, India had a tiny political elite, numbering perhaps a few thousand. Today, around 10 million Indians contest elections at all levels of the political system, people with direct material interests in the preservation of democracy. The social backgrounds of India's political class are fast changing, as large numbers of Indians, especially those lower in the social order, stream into the electoral arena, pushing up turnouts to consistent levels of 60% and more. Consider also the scale. In the classic modern debates about the possibilities of democratic government in large societies, in late 18th century America and France, their respective populations were 3 and 25 million. In India's national election currently underway, 700 million or more Indians, the great majority of them poor, many of them unable to write a sentence, will engage in a free act of collective choice. It's worth pausing over this bare figure. It represents, of course, the largest exercise of democratic election in human history. But it's also, I think, an index of what is, in fact, the largest reservoir of democratic experience within a single state, a resource for intellectual reflection that still remains underused. But beyond the logistics and machinery of democratic politics, it's important to recall the extent to which, everywhere, democracy starts from, emerges out of, local and practical problems, and from the arguments over how to address these. In mapping democracy's global life, we need, apart from its empirical descriptions, also to explore the diverse political imaginations and arguments that sustain or undermine democratic politics. To explain why democracy has had such various fates in different parts of the world is a complicated task, but a necessary part of any such explanation must be a sense of the ways in which democratic arguments were or were not made to speak to quite specific problems as they were perceived in particular locations. The subject of how India's democracy came to be is obviously too unwieldy for a single lecture. What I'd like to try to do is to suggest that it might be useful at this point in India's own history, as well as in our own attempts to make sense of what is perhaps the most striking feature about modern Western political ideas, that's to say their global extension. At this point, it may make sense to begin a systematic excavation of the ideas and arguments, the intellectual debates, which came together to make possible the Indian democratic experience. That is, time, that is, to take the ideas and arguments themselves seriously, and not to read them off some other logic or logarithm, the logic of capital, or to see them as the emanations of socioeconomic processes. What I hope to do is to reconstruct for you, partially and selectively, the responses of some of India's more reflective minds to the political predicaments in which they found themselves in the first half of the 20th century, and how some of these responses became part of the intellectual and political foundations of modern India. I think this kind of work is also, I think, imperative, or rather is part of what I think is an imperative task today of producing a global history of political thought. The central dilemma facing Indians under colonial rule early in the 20th century was this: how to create a representative political order at all, how to represent the collective entity fiction India, and how to enable within such an order the articulation of internal differences among its many elements, how to represent Indians who were also always something else as well: Tamil, Muslim, poor, Adivasi, Shakta, Brahmin. Indian intellectuals had thus to devise an order of political representation sufficiently singular and unified so that it could lay claim to self-rule, while also sufficiently plural as to be able to articulate internal differences. It had to be able to claim to represent both a totality or collectivity and simultaneously the disparate elements that formed this larger unity. This problem of how to create an idea of the people or nation, a representation of unity, which could also enable difference, is a central problem, of course, for any modern large-scale democracy, that is, of any representative order more generally. From the French Revolution and its long, troubled aftermath to the many and mainly failed attempts to establish representative democracy in post-colonial situations, it has bedeviled democratic efforts in the modern world. All too often it's led, as Alfred Cobbin put it in 1945, to a substitution of the sovereignty of the nation for the liberty of the individual. The problem has usually, or rather at its best, been posed in terms of sequence. First, establish unity by use of violent means if necessary, terror, civil war, ethnic purging. Then think about how to represent difference, plurality, where the latter, in fact, is invariably deferred and ignored. In the Indian case, this always already complex process or act of self-creation had to be accomplished in the face of the colonial assertion that India lacked anything like a representative order and was therefore fated to oscillate between despotism and anarchy in the absence of colonial control. This incited various lines of response in several phases, and I'd like to explore in very general terms the contours of these responses. If in the 19th century a recognizably liberal argument could be heard in Indian intellectual and political circles, one that stressed rights, separation of powers, free press and the law, but which had difficulty developing a conception of collectivity that could persuade large numbers, by the early 20th century, this was displaced by arguments that invoked civilizational and cultural motifs, appealing to evolutionary and monist schema, enabling Indian singularity to be portrayed as a universalism, and which suspected any forms of internal difference. But there was also a third phase and strand to these Indian arguments, which began to emerge out of the global political turbulence produced by the First World War. This line of thinking and practice, which encompassed figures in his later thought such as Tagore, Gandhi, and Nehru, was itself internally diverse in its preoccupations. It had varying capacities to focus on the specifically political dimensions of the problem, and it came to a different view within itself of how to try to align the demands of collectivity and individuality, representation and democracy. It tried to treat this not as something to be addressed in sequence or stages, but as a problem where the imperatives of unity and difference required simultaneous articulation into a complex political form. There was always something unstable about this line of response, making it vulnerable to external pressures, as well as its own internal tensions. And early on, of course, it met with spectacular failure in the partition of India. And I think there always remained a fundamental tension to this view between the claims of identity and the imperative to represent, a tension that continues to this day in sometimes benign and sometimes malign in its effects. How to create an order in which the weak, less equal, either numerically, minorities, religious or linguistic, or in terms of social power, Dalits, can be represented. This was a problem that India's political intellectuals grappled with. In building the claims of identity into the constitutional order, while also preserving strong powers and capacities to the state in order to constrain and even suppress such claims in the name of a larger identity claim, they tried to anchor the political order in divergent currents, and I'll return to this in my conclusion. I'd like to divide my remarks into three parts. First, I start by outlining the initial predicament of Indian intellectuals under colonial rule, one defined by India's enormous diversity and social divisions, and which denied the possibility of a common politics. Second, I turn briefly to how intellectuals in the line I'm most interested in attempted to address this predicament, developing, as I shall hope to argue, a sense of identity as provisional and subject to revision. Finally, I'll suggest how some of these ideas, which I think are quite different from Western conceptions of national identity, how these ideas feed into the political, and rather fed into the political and institutional architecture of post-independence India in the form of the Constitution. A couple of points at the outset. When I refer to Indian intellectuals, I don't intend a sociological sense, as, say, did the American sociologist Edward Shills in his 1950s study of intellectuals, which still remains a very valuable and almost unique such study. Rather, I'm simply using the term to mean political actors who self-consciously reflect on their own actions, and who also reflect on their own reflections and on each other's reflections. I'm referring, that is, neither to mere academic theoreticians, who generally do not act, at least in any immediately recognizable way, nor to politicians who are not in the habit of sustained self-conscious reflection. The second point concerns the forms of political thinking and argument in India. If one asks what sort of political self-knowledge can be found in India, what intellectual reflections on politics might be seen as sustaining Indian democracy, one has to acknowledge that, in contrast, say, to the Western history of political theory and practice, there are no founding texts of Indian democratic thought, no rich textual field which is focused on a distinct object or discipline of study, say politics, or on questions of the state or democracy. In modern India, one would be hard-pressed to find properly theoretical texts of politics. The exception might be Gandhi's remarkable 1909 work, Hind Swaraj, which is perhaps the most radical and original political text written by anyone anywhere in the 20th century, but that would require a separate discussion. On the other hand, there's a great deal of political thinking in a wide variety of genres. For instance, a striking feature of Indian discussions of politics in the 20th century is their intimate personal nature. Letters and autobiography, for instance, are two important forms in which political thinking is enacted, suggesting how Indians responded to the challenge of being rooted in what their colonial masters described as a non-political world, by expanding the domain of the political and infiltrating it into the personal self. So let me move on to the first part of what I would like to say this evening. The idea of devising a self-governing representative political order for India, one through which its people could live in freedom, collective and individual, was, in the late 19th and early 20th century, a possibility nearly inconceivable. For the space in which Indian intellectuals found themselves was defined by a denial of politics. This denial was an effect of two fierce and mutually reinforcing factors: British colonialism and the nature of the Indian social order. Colonial subjection rests on a double refusal to grant selfhood to Indians, in either collective or personal form. Indians did not constitute a nation, nor were they in any proper sense individuals. What defined them in the first instance was their racial difference from their British rulers, followed by their self-divisive communal identities, the many religions, languages, and still more castes of the subcontinent, attributes that resisted the demands at once of distinct nationhood and of a differentiated individuality. India, seen as a collection of mutually threatening communal identities, could not achieve any national representation. So, from the colonial administrator John Strachey's declaration in 1885 that there is not and never was in India, nor even any country of India, possessing, according to European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious. No nation, no people of India. From that to Churchill's remark 50 years later that India is a geographical term, it is no more united than the equator. The British consistently denied the possibility of collective Indian self or nationhood. In the absence of a pacifying presence of this colonial order, India's collection of disparate communities the British held would entropy either into despotism or anarchy. Over time, the British established a restricted arena of representative government, setting with due circumspection the scale and terms of Indian participation in it. Although British imperial ideology held aloft a principle of the development of self-government, especially for the white settler colonies, it was an emaciated specimen of that principle that was upheld in India. Narrow circles of representative government were created, beginning in the late 19th century at the municipal level, which soon came to be based on the view that electorates should be divided along community lines in order to protect numerically smaller and socially weaker communities. Into this circle were admitted a small class of educated Indians. Expansion was promised, but at velocities controlled by the British. The British thus retained control over the rhythms of Indian political life in what has been termed the waiting room theory of history. But the imperialists were not the only problem. Indeed, they were simply exploiting the indigenous social and religious divisions of India, divisions that seemed themselves equally to preclude the possibility of politics. The caste order systematically segmented groups and linked them together in a codified hierarchical division of labor. It was designed to resist the intervention of the state and state-made law and treated politics as extraneous. Religious differences, especially between Hindus and Muslims, similarly impeded an imagining of an Indian politics. How could these religious divisions be united into a common political subject able to rule itself? Thus, before Indians could even contemplate self-rule, they faced a prior task to formulate who the subject of such rule might be, to identify a subject capable of politics at all. This, in turn, required the creation of a representative form, of a collective idea or entity in whose name rights could be claimed, actions performed, and to which people could feel allegiance. This task of the creation of a representative order has proved to be one of the great obstacles to the emergence and consolidation of democracy in post-colonial territories elsewhere, from Nigeria through Algeria to Indonesia. And for Indians, there were few usable resources to draw upon when considering large-scale collective identity. Limited potentialities existed, for example, in the traditional idioms of kingship, and it's striking how few Indians recurred to kingly idioms. Although Indian intellectuals rummaged through the vocabularies of both traditional and modern politics for appropriate terms, the readiest term available, the nation, was, in the Indian context, as much beset by problems as it promised any solutions. For India, indeed, seemed to lack all the ingredients required by Western definitions of the nation. By the early 20th century, an argument over what such nationhood might be had developed. Spurred by developments in Bengal, some upper caste Hindus accepted the diagnosis that India's internal diversities and particularisms were disabling and wished to efface these. Impressed by the prowess of European nationalism, these thinkers saw homogeneity as the only possible basis for nationhood, and hoped that a common cultural and religious identity would be the glue, and would yield a distinctively Indian concept of the nation. As contemporary inheritors of this broad and resonant current, the Hindu nationalist BJP party was to put it in its manifestos of the 1990s, I quote, "One nation, one people, one culture." The importance of Western ideas and examples in shaping this religious nationalism is important to underline. The ideologue of Hindutva, the ideology of today's Hindu nationalists, V.D. Savarkar, was a non-believing Brahmin from Western India, an admirer and translator of Mazzini, who founded a secret society modeled on young Italy. Its members, planning to assassinate the viceroy, learned bomb-making from a Russian revolutionary in Paris. Aurobindo Ghosh, elected in classics at King's College, Cambridge, returned to rediscover and propagate what he saw as his spiritual traditions, melding ideas picked up from European idealist philosophy with Vedantist ideas. Meanwhile, Swami Vivekananda, similarly steeped in European thought, urged upon his young Indian followers the 3 Bs, beef, biceps, and the Bhagavad Gita. European history, as a repertoire of positive and negative examples, pervaded the thought of such men. In the late 1930s, Savarkar, for instance, in his speeches, pointed to Europe's failed nations, Poland and Czechoslovakia, and I quote him here, "ever a stern warning against any such efforts to frame a heterogeneous people into a hodgepodge nation. Unlike such," and this is his phrase, "treaty nations, Hindu India," again I'm quoting him, "was an organic national being." These organicist conceptions of the Indian political form denied the necessity of any representation of internal difference, and were a conscious riposte both to the colonial ideology and to the classical liberalism of the constitutionalist Congress Party. Adherents of such exclusive definitions of the nation, tied to a neo-Hindu identity, rejected democracy in its institutional forms as a pale substitute for the more vigorous, and this is a quote from Aurobindo, homogeneity of sentiment, which they felt must sustain national solidarity. Yet they could not fail to notice the pragmatic and instrumental benefits of democracy. It would be a means to ensure the permanent dominance of a Hindu majority, and to this end, some of them worked to indigenize notions of democracy. The attempt to find ancient and local roots for democracy was not, of course, unique to early 20th century neo-Hindu intellectuals. In 18th and 19th century Europe, political actors and thinkers in France, Germany, and Britain all advanced claims that democracy was not an invention of the Enlightenment, but had its roots in their own ancient societies, in Frankish, Goth, and Anglo-Saxon customs and practices. In the Indian case, in the early 20th century, there's an eruption of new works, often drawing on 19th century English social thought, which finds democratic antecedents in Hindu and sometimes also in Buddhist village communities with their own councils and deliberative assemblies. An attempt at indigenization, which continues to have its contemporary, although it should be said perfectly secular, adepts as well. The notion of a unified, homogeneous Hindu community was projected into an idealized village community. Almost immediately, though, this pastoral vision was challenged from several directions. On the one hand, by lower caste movements whose very existence testified to the internal divisions and conflicts among Hindus. The leaders of the low caste movements shared none of the high caste's romanticism about village life. Instead, they looked to central power, the colonial state, for protection from the upper castes, as well as advancement through quota policies and separate caste-based electorates, where the lower castes and religious communities could vote for their own candidates. To some lower caste intellectuals, such as B.R. Ambedkar, democracy understood as universal suffrage in electorates that were not divided, in fact undermined their hopes for remedy against historical injustice, creating a spurious representative order. As Ambedkar put it, and I quote, "Just as a king has no divine right to rule, so also a majority has no divine right to rule." Religious minorities also saw democracy as a direct threat. As early as the 1880s, Muslim intellectuals were concluding that it was impossible to devise a democratic representative order that incorporated both Muslims and Hindus. In a united India with a central state, Muslims would be a permanent minority, subject to the perverse effects of what was called numerical justice. Men like the educationist Syed Ahmed Khan and later the poet Muhammad Iqbal and the politician Muhammad Ali Jinnah read Western liberals like John Stuart Mill closely. They were troubled by arguments such as those advanced by Mill in his Considerations on Representative Government, and I'm quoting Mill here. Free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities, Mill had written. Each fears more injury to itself from the other nationalities than from the common arbiter, the state. Their mutual antipathies are generally much stronger than jealousy of the government. Both of these Indian lines of critical reflection, the lower caste intellectual argument articulated by Ambedkar, the Muslim one advanced by Jinnah, denied the possibility of democracy functioning within an ethnically mixed state. They represented, in fact, the strongest version of the classical liberal position in Indian debates. Ambedkar, in his striking 1940 work, Pakistan or the Partition of India, appealed to the lesson of Europe's long history and to the more recent examples of Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria, and was already concluding, again I'm quoting, that the transfer of minorities is the only lasting remedy for that the transfer of minorities is the only lasting remedy for communal peace is beyond doubt. It is such reasoning that would lead Ambedkar to advocate the creation of a Dalitsthan for India's scheduled castes. Although Ambedkar would later modify his views, at least on this latter point, in the 20th century argument over how to protect the interests of minorities, whether by creating territorial units homogeneous in their human content, or by means of constitutional legal safeguards operating within mixed populations. In that argument, he was clearly strongly attracted by the idea of the homogeneous state as the most reliable representative political order. How then to constitute a collective subject in the face of such antipathies? And how to find appropriate forms of self-rule? These problems preoccupied in different ways the three figures I want to now turn to, Tagore, Gandhi, and Nehru, and I want to say a little bit about the responses each man came up with. In all three cases, I'll need to simplify hugely from considerable complexity, and I'll be quite uneven in my treatment of each. Tagore was not in any obvious way engaged with the question of democracy, but his engagement with Western ideas of the self, freedom, and politics led him to devise a social philosophy that stands as an alternative to liberalism in its European definitions. To Tagore, India's, quote, apparent backwardness in politics, its absence of a clearly defined national essence and of a state, was in fact its strength. It had allowed India to avoid the instabilities of European politics, a politics based on constant negotiation between rivals and where numbers became the court of appeal. In such systems, Tagore argued, and I quote, government has to pass law after law to keep the warring heterogeneous elements somehow patched together, as if unity could be achieved, and again quote, by enacting a law that all shall be one. Instead of following the nationalist impulse to avoid danger by removing foreign elements, Indians needed to articulate into an alternative political principle their historical capacity to absorb and order. External elements had to be bound together by a basic idea. As he put it, the idea of India as a space of diverse self-descriptions. Tagore authored what would eventually become India's de facto motto, now worn bare with over, not to say misuse, unity in or unity through diversity, an idea that would later be articulated by Nehru in the discovery of India. In many ways, Tagore's view of India was a poetic fiction, an imaginative aspiration. It certainly was not an account of empirical sociological reality. But his writings were read by the elite, his songs sung by the masses in many parts of the country. And this idea, this fictional idea, managed, I think, to carve a trace both in Indian public life and on the imagination of the independent Indian state. Mahatma Gandhi, who in many ways dominated Indian intellectual and political life in the first half of the 20th century, also engaged with liberal premises and shared Tagore's ambition to work out an alternative universalism. Unlike many other non-Western reactions to liberalism and its practices, Gandhi's redefinition was not based on a culturalist or nativist rejection of liberalism's premises. Indeed, he shared the universalist ambitions of liberalism, as well as both its critical attitude to inherited authority and its commitment to experiment and revision when it came to the choice of political and ethical ends. His own autobiography, as you well know, was entitled The Story of My Experiments with Truth. But he rejected Western liberal understandings of the nation as homogeneous, as well as liberalism's disenchanted view of the sacred. Gandhi's ideas, in that sense, emerged out of the dual crisis of liberalism and religious belief, a crisis whose scope extended from Victorian England to the religious reform movements of India. Gandhi's arguments are often viewed as primarily religious and as anti-political. On the contrary, he had a radical idea of politics, one that extended well beyond the domain of state institutions and practices. He helped, I think, to politicize identities by challenging Indians to conceive of themselves not as held by the British or by the orders of caste and religion as fixed and immutable, but rather as containing a significant element of contingency, a potential space for self-reflection and self-transformation, and therefore for freedom outside the imposed identities of state and society. Such a political conception of the self is a crucial precondition for representative democratic politics. But this, of course, was not the purpose for which Gandhi developed his conception. For Gandhi, the state was anti-political, since it was founded upon violence and worked to impose order on what was seen as the unruly identities of caste, tribe, region, and religion. These, seen as rivals to the state, had to be subdued. So Indian self-rule did not involve capturing and using the instruments of the state, nor even devising a representative political order. Instead, it involved a process of self-transformation, as he traced out in his autobiography. Because self-rule was a personal, individual condition, a moral acquisition, not one manifest in the accountancy of numbers, democracy, as practiced in the West with its majorities and minorities, held no lessons for India. The essence, and I am quoting Gandhi here, the essence of democracy, Gandhi asserted, did not lie in numerical strength, but in the spirit behind even one person. Every man could represent a whole democracy. Yet Gandhi was now operating in new circumstances in India, which changed some of the terms of the debate about democracy. The years after the end of the First World War saw the emergence of a new social force in Indian politics. The peasantry and its political potentialities were unclear. New types of leaders were also emerging, religious men and populists, and new arenas of popular organization, religious pilgrim destinations like the Kumbh Mela, proclaimed as sites of spiritual democracy, as Kama MacLean has shown in her very interesting new work. New political forms such as peasant assemblies and sabhas were also becoming the object of intellectual interest, prompting a new materialist sociology of power, as Christopher Bailey has recently made clear. The emergence of mass politics could not but raise anxieties and ambivalence in the minds of intellectuals. Anxieties about the undisciplined mob, Gandhi, as also the dangers of militarist nationalism and fascist regimentation, an anxiety that Nehru often expressed. It led Nehru, who nowadays is habitually portrayed as a happy rationalist, to become preoccupied with, to use the contemporary term, the psychological, non-rational impulses, and above all, fear, and how this related to democracy. It's worth just noting as an aside that few Indian intellectuals withdrew into a conservative reaction in the face of the rise of the masses, as they did, for instance, in Europe, in a way that John Kerry's book on the masses and the intellectuals in Europe outlines. Perhaps in some ways, Rajagopalachari may, perhaps, or Bhagwan Das, but in general, there wasn't this conservative withdrawal. Gandhi's first mass political campaign in the 1920 Khilafat movement demonstrated both the power and the limitations of his conception. Orchestrating Hindus and Muslims into a united movement, he insisted that religious alliance was founded not on bargaining, not on bargaining and the conditionalities of contract, as in liberal theories of interest, but rather, as Faisal Devji has argued, on non-instrumental bonds, on friendship and assistance between those who had otherwise cause to fear one another. However, this period of religious unity was short-lived, and Gandhi's future efforts to recreate it were to founder. Gandhi's approach to the problem of caste inequality was also based on a non-instrumental conception of the relation between the powerful and those without power, on reform through persuasion and personal example. In his ashrams, he sought to create small communities of mixed religions and caste, built on notions of trust and personal friendship. Although his broader movements to abolish untouchability made an impression amongst upper caste Hindus, his efforts inspired skepticism among the lower castes themselves, as well as among India's Muslims. The more modernist and classical liberals, men like Ambedkar and Jinnah, both, as I've noted, broke with Gandhi, disbelieving in the possibility of representing difference and conflict within a common political order. They challenged Gandhi and Congress's claim to represent all Indians, a claim based for Gandhi neither on numbers nor on social, cultural, or religious likeness, but on moral firmness and sympathy. As Gandhi put it, to safeguard democracy, the people must have a keen sense of independence, self-respect, and should insist upon choosing as their representatives only persons as are good and true. Nor did Gandhi's anti-statist, small-scale, personal conception of politics, his suspicion of political parties, have much purchase on the idea of a democratic Indian state, the conception that the Constitution set out to elaborate. But Gandhi's politicization of the self, his insistence that identity was not trapped by religious or caste allegiance, as well as his paternalist sense of the need to attend to the general welfare of all Indians, these, I think, were a part of the crucial inheritance of those whose extensive deliberations resulted in the 1950 Constitution. Now, conceptions of the nation and of the state have become sort of favorite objects of criticism of recent trends that have dominated certainly history writing, but also more broadly post-colonial approaches to understanding India. Representation itself in this line of thought is seen as oppressive, a tool of sovereign power. But I think that there's a lot of there's very good reasons to resist that drift of argument. One reason why one should resist it is it's important to remind oneself of the political predicaments facing Indian intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century. And as I've been trying to outline, and to insist that any project of democracy, of political justice, needs a political form. And under modern conditions, it will have to be a representative order. Nehru, I think, serves as the link between the ideas of Tagore and Gandhi and their effective, if no doubt, partial translation into the habits of the independent Indian state. Nehru, as you all know, was in command of the Indian state for the first 17 years after independence. And he faced most directly the dual task of devising within the structure of a modern state a representative form which could give unity while also expressing difference. Before his prime ministership, however, he, like Gandhi, used, I think, autobiographical writing to develop his ideas of personal and national selfhood. More conventional nationalist autobiographies, of which there are many Indian examples, trace the author's path towards an integrated heroic self, ready to do battle against colonial rulers. But we find neither in Gandhi nor in Nehru's autobiographical writings a fully achieved personality. Instead, a fragile provisional self is revealed, a self which for both men is a site of political struggle. Nehru liked to portray himself as a product not of cultural fusion, but of tension, of the various elements he identified within himself: Kashmiri, Brahmin, Persian, Mughal, English, scientific, emotional, Indian, internationalist, writerly, public man, conflicted. All of these conflicted more often than they agreed. As he put it, I became a battleground where forces struggled for mastery. Importantly, he did not see the idea of the nation or of nationalism as a means of reconciling once and for all these interior conflicts. Nationalism, recent academic theorists insist, is the global diffusion of a standardized modular form devised in the West, whether in the French version of a community of common citizenship or in the folkish idea of a shared ethnic or cultural origin. Some historians argue that Indian nationalism is a derivative form, a local instantiation of a universal model. But I think, in fact, a quite different reading is possible, which would show that distinctive ideas of the individual and collective self are worked out by some Indian intellectuals. For instance, Nehru's understanding of the link between culture and power avoided the liberal presumption that individuals could transcend their cultural inheritance and remake themselves however they or their state saw fit. Equally, though, he steered away from the perception of cultures as self-enclosed wholes, as hermetic communities of language or belief, a view that in turn sustains two different positions. On the one hand, the conservative idea of the state as an instrument at the community's disposal, and on the other hand, the view of the state as a curator of cultural exhibits responsible for preserving communities. Rather, cultures, as he saw it, were overlapping forms of activity that had commerce with one another, mutually altering and reshaping each other. Today, this is a view which we might feel quite familiar with. It's the view that underpins sort of theories of multiculturalism, if you like. But it certainly wasn't an obvious way to think about the issue for a new nation-state 60 years ago. It may well be, and it may well have been then, and perhaps it always will be, too hopeful a view. It may well be that once one commits one's fate into the hands of a state, it is a one-way street towards the loss of pluralism and diversity, however much one might delay or slow the process. I don't know, and that, I think, really is the stake of the Indian project. That's the open question the Indian project still faces and has to address. Nehru's reading of the relation between cultures was, he insisted, one of the most valuable insights to be gleaned from a study of India's history. India was a society neither of liberal individuals nor of exclusive communities or nationalities, but, as he put it, of interconnected and historically accreted differences. As Indian independence approached, the pressure on Nehru and his counterparts to turn their ideas into a trustworthy representative order escalated. The challenge articulated by Jinnah of how to protect Muslim identities in the face of the majoritarian threat posed by universal suffrage in undivided electorates would in the end defeat Congress in its conception of nationalism and representative order. For Jinnah, territory, not law, was a more secure protection for the rights of India's Muslims. It was against the background of partition that Indians set about trying to reformulate the terms of a representative political order that could be trustworthy to its diverse peoples. And I think the 1950 Constitution is perhaps the most elaborate expression of India's democratic self-conception. The work of excavating the complex intellectual currents that came together to produce this political testament of the nation is still in its early stages. But I think one has to see the Constitution as the product of collective deliberation, stretched over 3 years. Over 7,500 amendments were tabled, 2,500 were moved, and a document of almost 400 articles emerged, one of the longest of its kind. So this was really a moment of very active deliberation, no doubt drawn from a small circle, from a sociologically very small base. Still, I think the document and the debates which produced it manifest an extraordinary frankness in trying to address the difficulties of creating a democratic representative order amidst India's diversity. And I think it serves as something of a refutation of the genetic fallacy which seeks to reduce ideas to ideology, to sociological origins. The Constitution, as you all know, recognized as the primary form of political representation the vote. As individual citizens, Indians were accorded fundamental civil and political rights, including the franchise for all adults, creating a single undivided electorate. But if universal suffrage recognized the first-order diversity of interests among individual interests, there were, both in the Constitution and in the early years of its practical enactment, also several instruments designed to recognize their differences as defined by group allegiances. One might call these instruments a system of second-order diversity. These political mechanisms were designed to organize India's uneven social diversity into a coherent representative form, to offer minorities protections from majoritarian will, to give the formerly called untouchables, now known as Dalits, remedies against upper caste oppression, and to recognize the presence and dynamism of a mass of cultural, linguistic, and individual identities. Instead of trying to build structural barriers and walls of separation, it chose provisional and inherently political methods, flexible but always open to contest and liable to be unstable. Three second-order forms of representing such diversity might be particularly noticed. The constitution makers, initially fearful of further partition, had wanted to see the federal principle as simply an administrative tool to distribute powers between center and region. They feared that aligning the claims of linguistic and cultural identities with territory would further threaten divisions in the country. But in fact, and this is a well-known story, when demands were made in the 1950s for linguistic states, Nehru did come round to conceding them. And contrary to initial fears, these did serve to stabilize and integrate the Union. The point is that regional identities were not seen as requiring absorption within an encompassing Indian one. And indeed, the Constitution enabled the state to recognize new identities, to accede to claims of various cultural groups for their own regional states and governments. More generally, on the issue of language, a subject that has vexed nationalisms everywhere, the Constitution and its subsequent managers achieved a sustaining compromise. No national language was adopted, but a menu of official languages, which can be constantly expanded, as you know. Second, the Constitution rejected the divided electorates favored by the British to protect religious groups. Now, in order to reassure the minority religions, especially Muslims, that elected majorities could not legislate in defiance of minority wishes, the Constitution gave religious minorities the option to be governed by their own customary civil laws. A situation of legal plurality was created. And while the document declared the ultimate ambition of a unified civil code, fulfilling that ambition was indefinitely deferred, left to the vagaries of politics. Nehru, given his views about the mutable transactional nature of cultures, had hoped and expected that these protections would change, and that individuals and their communities would in time opt for a common civil code. Here, his optimism proved misplaced. In later decades, Hindu nationalists were able to use such special provisions as fodder for their attacks, while conservative Muslim clerics have found in them a means to control their flock. Finally, and most crucially, the Constitution abolished the millennial caste order, delegitimating it with the stroke of a pen. And yet, of course, the social reality of caste was simultaneously acknowledged in order to help erase its effects, it was thought. A legislative policy of reservations, positive discrimination, was established for those lowest in the caste order, as well as for India's large tribal populations. This policy assigned reserved seats in the legislatures, as well as quotas in state employment and education. Such measures, too, were seen as temporary expedients, to be periodically reviewed and ultimately dispensed with. This, too, was to prove over-hopeful. But by such constitutional means, the fundamental markers of identity, language, caste, and religion, were granted a degree of fluidity and revisability, and that's really the point I want to stress here. This provisionalism rendered language, caste, region, and religion into primarily political rather than cultural categories, a major shift in their character, and a vital one because it served to bring them into democratic debate. It made them possible subjects of democratic politics. Let me come in conclusion to some failures. Actually, sorry, we'll say this. The techniques of compromise and deferral instance the refusal to anchor Indian identity in any single trait or set of traits. The tactic of temporizing in response to calls for decisive definitions of a uniform Indian identity, for instance, from advocates of Hindi as the national language or Hindu reformers who wish to abolish multiple legal codes in favor of a common one, has been seen as a potential weakness from the perspective of Western theories of nationalism, as well as from liberal theory. In fact, I think it was one of the more creative and enabling aspects of the nationalist imagination installed after 1947. It inscribed as a constitutional habit the practices that had made Congress successful as a national movement, practices which were themselves informed by the ideas and arguments of the major intellectual figures of the movement. Let me now come in conclusion to some failures and paradoxes of the struggle to create and sustain a representative democratic order. In important respects, India's ambition to represent its social diversity within such an order have often fallen short. India has experienced episodes of violent regional secessionism, Punjab, the Northeast, Assam, incidents of caste violence in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, periods of savage religious killings and mayhem, Bombay, Gujarat, and always, of course, the unending despair of Kashmir. And yet, set this unhappy sequence against the other historical cases of large agrarian ancien regime societies, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, China. Beside these examples, the violence India has experienced over the past 60 years seems something of a historical discount. Much of the recent discussion of democratic transitions, the transition to a new figuration of power embodied in a new representative democratic form, has focused on the shift from authoritarian regimes and dictatorships to democratic ones. That is, a shift from one modern regime to another modern regime. But India's transition to a democratic regime and its consolidation is different and cannot be mapped by the terms of the existing democratic transitions literature. In fact, what we see in India is a historical or an epochal shift from an ancien regime to a modern political form. And in that sense, it's one that's truly a transition of Tocquevillian proportions. Such shifts are wrenching, often bloody affairs. Think again of the violent histories, internal and external, of America and France since the 18th century, as they struggled to make themselves democratic nation-states. Of course, India remains rich with potential for further failure. The ideology of Hindutva endures, the dream of dealing with difference, the problem of difference by abolishing it. Its counterpart is a fragmenting identity politics, preoccupied with difference and how to thrust it into the political realm, which evades altogether the task of building any common political project. Yet, paradoxically, the very things that Strachey and Churchill and so many others had claimed precluded India from becoming a nation may in fact have proved fruitful material for this task, for two reasons. Diversity has made it difficult to entrench majoritarian or dominant identities. And second, diversity has forced India's political elites to be inventive. They could not create a sense of nationhood simply by imitating existing models. In a second paradox, it is precisely the workings of India's democracy that have nourished identities that threaten it, by leading to majoritarian excess and minoritarian obduracy. The identities of religion and caste that figure increasingly in Indian politics are the creations of democratic politics and not the intrusion of the primordial. And as such, they will have to be contained and disarmed by the resources of democratic politics itself. Thus, India today is a field where ideologues of Hindutva and the advocates of lower caste emancipation must confront one another and others, a field where there is a regular open competition to persuade people to see themselves in one way or other as Hindu, low caste, poor, Bengali. In this sense, India has become a profoundly politicized society, perhaps the most so in the world. And this has turned the Indian world upside down, so that we see Brahmins in Uttar Pradesh helping to vote into power a Dalit woman as their chief minister. Indian democracy has been, in part, an argument over the terms through which to represent diversity, an argument over what it is to be Indian. The intellectual debates and the tradition I have held up for your consideration this evening here saw Indians as necessarily condemned to politics, not because they believed this was a medium through which to achieve utopian ends, but because this was the available means to find freedom. Freedom meant, in the first instance, being able to choose who they were and how they wished to be seen. The invention of a representative order that enabled that sometimes dangerous liberty, even if not in full measure, is not the least acquisition of the Indian democratic experience. Thank you.